Good afternoon, everyone. It's just after 2 o'clock. I think we'll be joined by a few more who seem to be in the waiting room, but I have several announcements, so I guess as I speak, they can be let in. So hello, everyone. My name is John Servos. I'm the Director of Commercialization Education at Fast Forward Medical Innovation, also known as FFMI for those of us joining us outside of the region. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Before I introduce our speaker, I do have a few things that I would like to cover, including some technical housekeeping items. Please keep your microphone and your video muted throughout the webinar so we can cut down on any background noise and any distraction. If you would like to ask a question today, please type it into the chat feature. And if you don't want to type your question, you can also submit an X to indicate that you would like to unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself. I, as well as several FFMI team members, will be monitoring the chat function, and then we will address these questions periodically during the presentation, and then again at the end. Note that the presentation is being recorded, and we will share both the recording and the PDF version of the slides with you. That's going to be important because you will also see during the presentation that there are several clickable links that you will want to have access to. So today's webinar is entitled Finding Your Why, the Significance and Incentives to Commercializing Academic Research. It's intended to underscore the significance and provide clarity to the process of commercializing research discoveries so that academics can discover their why. It is provided by Fast Forward Medical Innovation, a unit of the University of Michigan Medical School Office of Research, where we help biomedical researchers accelerate innovations from idea to impact. Brad, if you want to advance a slide, there we go. There's a snapshot of the group and our tagline. And here you see we have 4 functions of FFMI. We provide education such as this webinar and additional courses to teach commercialization concepts. Excuse me. We have multiple funding opportunities that go with mentorship. We have a business development team to connect investigators with company partners. And then we also provide these services across a state and nationwide network as part of a hub. Today's webinar is the first of 7 that we are offering as this series. And broadly, the goal of the series is to outline and describe critical concepts related to commercialization, analyze unique paths to market, and appraise diverse models of academic and industry collaboration. You can see a full lineup here on the next slide, or as well as on our website. And I'll note quickly that the next webinar that we are offering is on June 24th, and that will focus on the preclinical development of therapeutic innovations. The final note from me that this audience might find interesting is the FFMI Innovation Studio, which is new. This is very similar to office hours for innovators that are working on a project. But we're going to enhance the typical office hours experience by having you register in advance with a description of what your innovation is and some preliminary questions. And that will allow us to reach into our network of contacts and invite them to attend the Innovation Studio with you to get better answers for your project. So more information on the studio and registration can also be found on our website. Okay. Now with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Brad Martin. Brad is the Managing Director of FFMI and has 15 plus years of experience in the development of drugs and biologics. He has particular expertise in preclinical development and translational research in the field of cardiovascular physiology and regenerative medicine. Prior to leading FFMI, Brad led the FFMI MTRAC program. He served as a mentor in residence for the University of Michigan Tech Transfer Office. He was the Director of Product Development at Astrum Biosciences and the Director of Cardiac Research at Osiris Therapeutics. He also spent several years as a principal scientist with Pfizer's SBIR division. He received his PhD in physiology from the University of Michigan, and he completed a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin. So thank you for joining us today, Brad.
Geez, that's quite an introduction there, John. Well, thank you, John. And I'm glad you all could be here today. Take time out of your what looks to be a very nice day weather-wise. So this is today's agenda that we'd like to talk about here. Should be about 35 to 40 minutes at the most of material here for me to cover. What we're going to talk about today is basically what is research commercialization, in academia all about, and why is it important? We'll talk about the incentives to commercialize, both incentives to the university or the institution, as well as to yourself as a research investigator. And I'll spend a bit of time talking about how you can get started in this process and where you can find support if you believe it's an activity that you would like to become engaged with. Before I dive into what commercialization is really all about, we need to take just a little bit of history here. And that's because prior to 1980, any research that was funded by the NIH or federal dollars was owned by the federal government. And in the late 70s, the federal government held almost 28,000 patents, and less than 5% of those were ever licensed out to industry or to the private sector. And so the bottom line is that the taxpayers were not getting the biggest bang for their buck in terms of the investment in research dollars. And so in 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act was passed. What that essentially did is it transferred ownership of intellectual property for technologies developed with federal dollars from the federal government to the university. And so after Bayh-Dole, universities owned IP that was developed by their investigators. I will also just mention, and I'll stress that the university owns the IP, not the investigator. Sometimes researchers are surprised to learn that they do not personally hold the IP for technologies that they've developed, but rather it's held by the university. Universities have also been encouraged by the federal government to partner with industry when appropriate to translate these ideas and to reinvest those dollars into the university's R&D engine. That's exactly what's happened here. So you can see in the graph on the right-hand side that since since about 1980, there's been a precipitous increase in patents that have been issued to the university, and they're then able to then license those out to the private sector. And I'll talk about why that the universities holding those patents has been important for both their profile as a research institution as well as for their economic development. So Bayh-Dole has really been a game changer in how intellectual property is handled by the university. Shifting gears a little bit now to translational research. Translational research is one of those words that means a lot of different things depending upon who you ask. Translational research can refer to the process of moving a basic science technology to the point of commercialization. It can also mean, depending upon who you're talking to, the process of licensing a technology out of the university into the private sector. And in the eyes of the NIH, translational research has been defined using this 5-point scale here, T0 through T4. This to some degree correlates with the clinical trial process. So you'll see down here at the bottom left, T0 is basic research. T1 is the translation to humans. T2 is the translation to patients. T3 is translation to practice. And then 4 is community translation. This in a very general sense, correlates to the phases of the clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. The T2 level here, you'll see represents the phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, while T3 and 4 occur after product approval by the FDA and launch to the public. So that is how the NIH looks at translational research, moving it from the academic environment into the communities. Another scale that's been pushed forward here in the last few years is something called the Technology Readiness Level, or TRL. The TRL is a 9-point scale between TRL 1 and 9 that is used to assess the degree of risk in a technology and how fully it's been developed. I should point out, though, that TRL levels are typically used more for engineering technologies. This was developed by NASA in 1989, and oftentimes you'll see TRL levels associated with technologies in the communication space, energy, aerospace, that kind of stuff. You don't see that used too much in the life science space, but it is used for risk management by the funding organizations, particularly those that make funding decisions in the area of engineering technologies. NSF, Department of Defense, or DARPA will use TRL levels quite a bit. This is kind of a 10,000-foot view here of the path to market. Again, showing the basic research, or the process of moving from basic research through translational research, and at this point meaning that transfer from the private sector to industry by the Tech Transfer Office. The Tech Transfer Office can license technologies out to existing companies in the form of a license. They can license it to a startup company and help nurture that startup company and get it going. Or there can be academic and industry partnerships, typically in the form of co-development or sponsored research. All of the common path of all of these is leading into the marketplace and impacting public health. In a very general sense, there's a continuum from advancing knowledge to using knowledge and engaging society. And for the most part, what we saw with those NIH guidelines, the T0 through T4, happen to be involved in that left-hand side of this continuum, basic research to technology transfer, and that translational piece. On the other hand, TRL and the engineering side of things happens to focus more on technology transfer to the marketplace and the licensing piece of this. The problem is that that continuum is not as smooth as you might think. There is a gap between basic science and translating that to the clinic. And that's sometimes referred to as the valley of death. And this is a cartoon that you may be familiar with. We use it quite a bit. The idea here is that on the left-hand side is where ideas are formed and developed in the university, research institutes, and health systems. And on the right-hand side are those that are ready to invest and receive these technologies. Entrepreneurs, the private sector, and the business community. And the problem is that this gap is getting farther and farther apart. And as John mentioned, at Fast Forward, we try very hard to try to bridge this gap and help our investigators de-risk a technology to the point where it does become very attractive to the private sector on the right-hand side. This is a graph or a figure that I came across that looks at this valley of death in a little bit of a different way, and there's a lot of good information here, so I wanted to share it. What you see on the bottom here in the green is the 9-point TRL technology readiness level I talked about before. In the yellow are the actors, or those that are actually doing the work where this activity occurs. Academia, government labs in the earlier stages, and in the private sector, businesses and small companies in the middle and later stages. And where the funding comes from. Again, private sector money, VC money being on the right-hand side, more towards the industry side of things, whereas most basic research is funded through NIH or government funding of some kind. Now, the red line here represents the amount of resources that are required. So this is where we see that valley of death again. In universities and in small research institutions, there is a level of funding that exists. But when we get into that gap between academia and industry, there's that loss of funding, that loss of resources. And that's that valley of death, which occurs right about at technology readiness levels 3 to 6, somewhere in there. Another way to look at it, and I think take that bridge analogy a step further, if you think of this bridge, if you will, being held up by a number of girders that each represent a risk. There is a risk that the science may not work out. There is a risk that you may not be able to attract funding. There is a risk that there may be a regulatory problem or a safety signal that you can't overcome. Intellectual property may not be able to be secured, or there may not be a market for it, God forbid. The point is that if any of these risks cannot be mitigated and cannot be overcome, the bridge will fall down, okay? So there is a number of things that have to go right at each step for you to traverse from a discovery to the point of impacting patient care. And just as an example here, I've shown the very general pipeline for developing a therapeutic down below, going from target validation to finding a lead, to doing chemistry, and then clinical trials. At each of these stages, there are a number of risks. These risks exist at each step in this process. And so particularly for a drug that's being developed, there is a very convoluted and long path to the market. And that is shown to some degree in this slide. I don't expect you to be able to read this. There's a bit of an eye chart, but what it really shows is the process in detail, in great detail, for developing a small molecule or a biologic. And what these various colors represent is the preclinical research, lead optimization, GLP toxicology studies. And the point is that there are a number of steps that you have to go through to go from a basic research idea to an approved drug. Very convoluted, very long, and a lot of things that can go wrong. And that's why when we talk about drug development in particular, it's a very long and risky road. You have to go from a process of looking at potentially 5,000 to 10,000 compounds to be able to test 250 in your preclinical models, to maybe get 5 in clinical trials, to maybe at the end of the day have 1 FDA-approved drug. Also note the time frame on the bottom here. I think the time frame is a little bit long in this example. It doesn't necessarily have to be this long. In fact, much of what we do with our investigators is try to figure out ways to shorten this timeline, but it's still a very long and convoluted process. I'll also point out too that look at the basic sizes of a phase 1, 2 in phase 1, 2, or 3 clinical trial. These are generalities, but in a general sense, a phase 1 trial involves a couple dozen patients or volunteers. A phase 2 involves a couple hundred, and a phase 3 involves a couple thousand. You can imagine when we're talking about and some cardiovascular studies have 10,000 patients per cohort. You can imagine when we're talking about numbers that high, the cost becomes quite expensive. But the bottom line is that there is a lot of attrition that goes on between the original discovery and finding 1 approved drug. And that's because of all those risks that I mentioned previously. Any one of those risks can result in one of these compounds being thrown out. For medical devices, it's a little bit different. I wouldn't say that it's easier. It's just a little bit of a different process. And many times you happen to know exactly what the clinical problems you're trying to solve and how a device may, either as a diagnostic or as a therapeutic, affect that disease. The problem with devices is that the steps here involving invention and prototyping of a device, this can be a very long iterative process. You're going to have a discovery, you're going to come up with a prototype. You'll test that prototype, and 9 times out of 10, that prototype won't be exactly quite right. You're going to have to go back and do some more bench testing and redesign. Oftentimes, you can go around this loop time and time and time again before you finally find a device that is just right for ameliorating the disease as well as being biocompatible and conducive to the clinical condition, at which point you move on to the clinical trial process, regulatory, and product launch. The one thing I will point out too is that very early on, and this is especially important for devices, is you need to do a market assessment. It'd be a shame to go through all of this process and spend the time, money, and effort to launch a product only to find out that the market really does not need or want that device. So more so than for therapeutics, market assessment is really important. If you ask a patient if they need a cure for cancer and a drug, they'd say, of course. Whether they need a device to cure a particular condition is an open question. So do that market assessment early on. Also note here too, where the divide between largely academia and the non-dilutive funding you would get through grants and the private sector work with dilutive funding occurs. Right at this phase between preclinical and clinical. That's oftentimes where that handoff is made between the university and the private sector for a device. But it can vary depending upon the device itself and the need you're trying to address. I think at that point, we'll pause for any questions that you've either submitted via the chat function or asked to John directly. John, do we have any questions to address at this point?
We don't have any submitted at the moment, if we want to give it 30 seconds or so.
Yeah, if any of you want to unmute yourself and chime in, this is one of the breaks I've built into this to address any questions you may have. No? Okay. I'll move on then. And what I want to talk about for the next couple of minutes here is why commercialization and translational research is important for both the university as well as for you as an investigator. From the university standpoint, again, since 1980 with the Bayh-Dole Act, being able to license out technology developed by their investigators has been incredibly important for the university's economic livelihood and the ability to support R&D. I have a couple of examples here and numbers related to the University of Michigan, just as an example of how we have been able to leverage our technologies from our investigators. And just in 2019 alone, we had licensing revenues of almost $16.3 million, which is up from 2018. 232 license and option agreements, which is up from 218 in the year before. The university has launched 22 startups and licensed technologies to 86 companies over the past 5 years, issuing a number of almost 200 patents were issued. And again, all of these have seen an uptick in the last couple of years. I think to some degree because of the support that research received from our office, technology transfer office, and some of the others around campus. And all of this technology that's been developed in the university has been a real windfall for the institution in terms of their economic returns. So this is a revenue chart that shows how the money is distributed when a licensing deal is done. So if there is a licensing contract that's completed, you can see that depending upon the size of the license, the size of the exit, between $200,000 and over $2 million, there's a distribution between the inventors themselves, personally, the department, the school, or the college. And this is at the University of Michigan, and there are, I'm sure, various distribution charts or regulations for each institution across the state, but most of them involve some degree of separation between the PI, the department, and the college. And so by licensing all of these technologies over the past few years, the university has had a tremendous influx of capital into its coffers that they can then reinvest. The university has invested more than $1 billion in startup companies since 2012, largely because of the revenue received from licensing. They have created 2,000 jobs with these companies and have funded a number of projects through both the directly from the institution as well as the MEDC. I should actually take a moment to mention the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, or the MEDC. This is the state of Michigan's innovation and entrepreneurship arm. They have a relationship with the universities across the state where they are funding and supporting the development and translation of commercially viable and commercially important technologies. And since 2014, when the MTRAC program was launched, they have funded 295 academic projects, which have resulted in 47 companies, a number of jobs, almost $200 million in follow-on funding. So the state, as well as the university, received a tremendous economic impact from these the technologies being developed and then commercialized. Also looking at the institution itself, how important is having solid translational technologies available? The answer is very important. This is a graph showing industry partnership dollars to the university. So this is, our business development group has been very active in engaging industry. And this graph here shows the number of awards from industry to the university in terms of sponsored research or co-development deals, with the eventual goal of commercialization. So this is an earlier stage, a little bit upstream from commercialization, but it really is still in that translational pipeline, if you will. So since 2008, the University of Michigan has gone from about $35 million in industry awards to almost $120 million. If you look at the yellow line, that represented back in the 2008, less than 8% of our total R&D budget. And now, with again, almost $120 million, that represents almost 20% of our total R&D budget for the medical school. In other words, 20% of the R&D dollars that the University of Michigan receives are from private sector business engagement. The vast majority, the remaining 80%, are probably from NIH or federal sources, but the fact that almost 20% comes from industry is a major change over the last decade or so. In terms of, it's a little bit difficult to come up with a graph or a figure to demonstrate this, but having a robust ecosystem is also very important for the universities to attract and retain top-level talent. I think especially younger talent, junior faculty, are more entrepreneurial-minded. They think that they have innovation that they can bring to bear. So I think that having a university where innovation and entrepreneurship is supported, encouraged, and there are resources available will help you retain and attract top-level talent. So that's really been important for the institution as well. But what about you personally? It's great for the university to have all this revenue return. But what about you personally? Why should you bother? You have active labs, you have grants you need to write, you have promotion and tenure to consider. Why should you bother thinking about commercialization? I would hope that for many of you, the reason may be somewhat altruistic, but you're hoping to have the outcome of your research and your technologies actually impact patient care. I think that many people are involved in the life science, if you ask them, would say that to some degree or another, they got into the business because they wanted to improve human health or the human condition. It's not a lofty goal, but it's something that you can certainly do. But if you want to have any sort of impact beyond the four walls of your institution, somebody's going to have to commercialize that at some point. A good example of that is somebody named Robert Bartlett. Dr. Bartlett is a professor of surgery, thoracic surgery at the University of Michigan. This is a somewhat old example, but it's just so striking that I use it every time. Dr. Bartlett, back in the 80s, developed something known as ECMO, extracorporeal oxygenation membrane oxygenator. What this is essentially, it's a extracorporeal circuit that takes the place of the lungs. It's essentially a bypass machine for the lungs. It takes the workload of gas exchange and oxygenation off of the lungs for a period of time so they can recover. This has been especially important in newborn babies that have underdeveloped lungs, premature babies, but it's also been important for a number of other pulmonary conditions in adults. Dr. Bartlett did this in the early 80s with very limited resources. There was no orchestrated effort on behalf of the university to bring these sorts of technologies forward. He really drove this forward because of his compassion and his real drive to impact patient care. This is a picture in 1995 of all the patients that have been saved, literally saved, because of his technology. And again, in the last 20 years, I can only imagine that this picture would be multiple times bigger. But I can only imagine how satisfying this has got to be for Dr. Bartlett to see the work that he's put in actually result in saving lives. And this is just a tip of the iceberg. Any of you that have got compelling technologies, if you want to save lives, somebody has to commercialize this and bring it to the patients. Another opportunity for you as an investigator happens to do with the problems that industry is facing. There's been a paradigm shift in the way industry does its research and development. In essence, it doesn't anymore. Prior to the 2000s, certainly prior to 2009, most large companies, pharma companies, medical device companies, had very large research and development operations. They put a lot of money into developing technologies internally. They don't do that anymore. What they have found is that it's cheaper and easier for them to buy technologies from academia than it is for them to develop them in-house. And what this graph is showing here is that the gray bars show the amount of research expenditures in industry. They've been pretty flat, but the black line shows the amount of profits that the industries reinvest into their R&D. So what you've seen that since 2009, they're not reinvesting into their own internal R&D. And so they're making up that gap by additional external funding to academia. So rather than developing their assets like they used to do back here, they're now paying for them from from academia and bringing them in internally. Now, in order for that to happen, they're not going to buy just anything. They now have the entire country to choose from. They're shopping around at all the colleges across the country. And what they want to find is that assets that have been more fully de-risked or translated are going to be more attractive. So the more work you can do to de-risk your technology, to do the well-controlled studies in animals, to do some preliminary safety testing to understand PK/PD, the more you've actually de-risked that technology, the more attractive it's going to be to industry, the more likely they're going to be to actually write you a check and license that technology from the university. Another reason to bother, if this is what motivates you, there's a chance for personal financial returns from licensing of your technologies. So this is the same chart I showed you before, but I want to point out that there is consistently a very high percentage of the revenue that goes back to the inventor himself at the University of Michigan anyway, depending upon the size of the deal. Between 50 and 30% of the revenue goes to the inventor. That is the investigator who filed the patent. So there is a chance for you personally to recoup some revenue, and buy a nice car if that's your motivation. The other piece is promotion and tenure. This is an activity that you should engage in because it's good for your career development within the university. Over the past 10 years or so, the Michigan Medical School has begun to consider innovation and entrepreneurship portfolios as part of their P&T process. I should say that the medical school lagged behind a little bit. The College of Engineering was looking at innovation and entrepreneurship portfolios much earlier. But since 2013, the medical school is as well. So you can see here in the cover letter from the dean to our faculty, they want them to present an innovation, entrepreneurship, outreach, and creative activity portfolio, okay, and document this work in your, when you be considered for promotion and tenure. So how a patent compares to a science or nature paper is yet to be determined, but at least they're considering the effort that you put into developing a patent as part of your P&T guidelines. So it could be very important for you to achieve tenure at your university. A couple other things that are important to consider for you as a faculty member is why you should bother. If you are part of a team, or if you are the inventor of a technology that eventually goes to multi-site clinical trials and eventually is approved, you're going to be speaking at national meetings, you're going to be on the podium, you're going to be viewed as the person that developed this technology and drove it forward. There's a certain prestige that goes along with that among your peers. Also working with translational experts, investors, business development folks, industry, you're going to expand your network and your knowledge of the development pathways. This is a great resources to have for future development, having that network of people that you can call and just bounce ideas off of. And also, as I said, you all have active, busy labs that you're trying to fund. You have to support postdocs and graduate students. Working with industry with either collaborative research or co-development with the goal of commercialization at the end. That is a revenue stream for your lab. You can support graduate students. You can buy equipment with that money. So having a relationship with industry could be beneficial both to your staff as well as your laboratory itself and the budget for your lab. And I will stop here again one last time for questions. Anything, John?
Yes, we do have a question. It says, for fast forward medical innovation, is there a path to commercialization for other areas of research beyond drug development and medical devices?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. This is a very high level discussion here today on the general process of commercialization. I'm using therapeutics as an example often because it just demonstrates how convoluted the process can be. But fast forward supports and has resources for what we call our 4 verticals, and that's therapeutic development, device development, diagnostics, and health IT. Each of those is a little bit different in terms of what they require, the resources that they need, and but we do have expertise in all 4 of those sectors.
And then I'll add on, if the innovation that you're thinking about falls outside of those product categories, our educational programs can be very helpful. Whether you're working on a research tool or an educational curricula or a training curricula, an anatomical model for training purposes, all of the educational programs provided by FFMI can help you in that way too.
I mean, we're sort of expanding the definition too of innovation. Innovation now also sort of includes operational type of improvements, better delivery of clinical care. That may not be hugely commercially viable, but we certainly help develop those as well if they can impact patient care. And actually, as John said, if it falls outside of those 4 verticals, through the guise of our innovation studio, contact us. And if we don't have the expertise, we can find the people that do. We really strive to be the front door for your questions. And so if you have any questions related to commercialization or development of a technology, no matter what realm it's in, contact us so we can find the right people to help you out.
Okay, the next question submitted is, how do you assure that the percentage of profit or revenue goes to the innovator?
In terms that you actually get 30% instead of 25%? That's all handled by the Tech Transfer Office. The process by which they divide it you're involved in the inventor is involved in the process and sees the contracts and the license agreements. So they're certainly aware of what the dollar figures are. But that split is made by the tech transfer office. Okay.
The next question asks, there are reports that say that from 2008 onwards, 70% of medical device R&D was led by industry and not by governmental funding. How do you link such a claim to yours?
I would have to see the figures and see the data. I don't have a quick response for that. Certainly, it's been my experience in the last decade or so. We have seen a much stronger interest in device companies looking at our academic projects. I will say too that the reduction in pharma, the reduction in R&D that I showed about 2008, was much more focused in pharma than it was in devices. Pfizer in Ann Arbor is a good example. But certainly pharma took a huge hit in terms of their R&D expenditures. That may not be quite as extensive in the device sector. But we certainly we've seen a big uptick too, though, in terms of how many companies are looking to access our technologies. Okay. So I don't have a good answer for that, sorry.
What advice would you give for labs seeking to develop stronger R&D ties with industry?
I would contact so depending upon whether you're at the University of Michigan or somewhere else, I would contact your business development group. They can act as a liaison between you and the industry. They understand what the industry sector is looking for. Our BD group is typically talking to pharma companies, device companies on a routine basis, and understand where their ever-changing areas of interest are. And it does change quite a bit. So contact your BD folks and let them put you in touch with, and make sure that they're aware of what you're doing so that when they contact industry, they can advocate for your technology on your behalf.
What stage of development do you get involved in the path of commercialization?
Yeah, I'll talk about that here in just a second.
Okay. And then an FFMI team member pointed out that perhaps the discrepancy in the discussion about R&D led by industry rather than governmental funding might include merger and acquisition costs that are associated with that R&D.
It could be. Thank you, Michelle. Okay.
Okay, carry on.
So as I mentioned here in the last, I think I have 3 or 4 more slides. And what I want to talk about is when should you get involved in this process? When do I have something that's worth translating? What we typically see is that people will go through working on a project for a number of years. They'll have NIH grants for a period of time. They'll have numbers of publications. Then you sort of get to a natural point where you sort of move from R&D to what I'll call product development. When you're no longer really testing a hypothesis, that's when I would say that's product development. That is to the point, that's really the point too, where you're going to have a much harder time getting an R01 grant, for example, around an idea. The NIH typically does not fund product development. They really want you to focus on more of the basic science. But as your work through its natural progression goes from basic science to product development, that's about the time you want to be thinking about reaching out to some of the resources that exist at your institution for translational research. The other thing to consider too is how novel is your research? Research that is highly novel, highly original, like Dr. Bartlett's ECMO, really attracts a lot of interest from industry at a much earlier stage. There's a higher drive for commercialization. In contrast, if you're working on the 4th or 5th generation of a beta blocker or a statin, let's say, where maybe you have some modest improvement in bioavailability or modest improvement in pharmacokinetics, that's not a huge need. That's not a huge improvement in the technology. So there's really a favor. Things that are highly novel are favored over those that are slightly more iterative. The other thing to consider too is how large an unmet need is your research focused on. If you are trying to cure triple-negative breast cancer and have a drug that targets some novel aspect of triple-negative breast cancer, that's going to be a huge unmet need. If you're trying to address a fairly uncommon or rare disease, or disease in which there's already some pretty good therapies out there, that might not be quite as attractive to industry partners or the private sector. They want to see there's going to be a huge need for this and a huge demand for this if they're going to put all the money into development. And the other thing I'll mention too is that the timeline and the valuation vary by sector. As I mentioned for pharma, the timeline was really very long, years, very expensive. But on the other hand, because of the potential money that a pharmaceutical agent can make, you usually get a much higher valuation. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're developing an app for telemedicine, it may not take you very long to develop that app, but there's probably not going to be nearly the return or the valuation from the industry partner that there would be for a much more lucrative pharmaceutical, if you would. And then even within a given sector, even within pharmaceuticals, some things are just oftentimes very hot. Because, for example, we're seeing deals with antibodies, cancer treatments, antibodies for cancer treatment, sometimes being done as early as on preclinical research. No clinical research, no clinical first-in-man studies at all. My point being that because antibodies are so promising, they're willing to take the risk and acquire an antibody technology from a university much earlier on than they would for a small molecule. So certain sectors are hotter than others, and will drive higher valuations and shorter timelines, is the point there. How do I get started? If you think that you have something that sort of meets these criteria, falls into one of these buckets, the very first step would be to go to your tech transfer office and file an invention disclosure. The tech transfer office can then, and I should mention too that you should not, I repeat, should not publish on anything that you feel has got commercial application until you've talked to your tech transfer office and protect your IP through an invention disclosure. They will also give you guidance on how and when to communicate your results, and they have mentors as well that can help guide you through the process of translating your work and actually forming a company when it's appropriate. So the tech transfer office is a great partner of ours. There's their phone number if you're at the University of Michigan. Give them a call. John already talked a little bit about our office at Fast Forward. We are a unit of the medical school's Office of Research, and we support all medical school faculty. And the easiest way, as I said before, we consider ourselves to be sort of the front door. If you have any questions about the suitability for commercialization of your technology, just give us a call. We do idea consultations all the time. And again, if we don't have the resources available within Fast Forward, we can bring in our experts from around the campus and other stakeholders to the Innovation Studio. We have educational programs. Again, this is part of our educational programs as a whole, but we have a number of them ranging from short 1-hour courses like this to 5-week deep dives into customer discovery. A number of educational programs, and a lot of times that's often the first entry point for an investigator into the commercialization pipeline, is our educational programs. They're free of charge. They'll help you better understand where your technology stands right now and how it fits into the overall pipeline. And oftentimes people that come out of the educational programs realize that the technology does indeed have some real value, and then apply for translational funding and mentorship from our office. And one of those funding streams, as I mentioned, is from the state of Michigan, the MEDC, the MTRAC program. So our office can certainly help. Additional support, if you're not from U of M, or if you're not in academia, the MEDC does support smart zones across the state of Michigan. So the MEDC supports universities through this MTRAC program that I've mentioned. If you are a startup company or not associated with the university at all, you can always access the state of Michigan's resources and dollars through what they call their smart zones. In the Ann Arbor area, Washtenaw County, our smart zone is called Ann Arbor Spark, but there are 15 smart zones across the country, which are shown here on this map, and you can also visit them on their website. But there, at each of those smart zones, you can access startup funds. There are grants for finding C-level talent, your first CEO, prototyping funds, a variety of funds that are available to small companies. And lastly, I'll just say, if you all happen to be a company as well, you probably have heard about SBIR and STTR grants. These are grants from the NIH for companies. These are not for universities or university research, they're for companies. Usually for very small startup companies that are looking to sort of, again, bridge that commercialization gap, that valley of death. Forming a company for the basis of getting an STTR or SBIR grant is usually not a good idea. I would try to hold off as long as you can and utilize your university resources as much as possible. But if you are a company, I would point you to a fantastic resource called BBC Entrepreneurial Training. They have an incredible track record of being able to improve the success rate of SBIR grants. They're located right here in Washtenaw County, but their services are available nationwide. They can help tremendously with specifically SBIR and STTR grants. And with that, gone on a little longer than I wanted to, but I will stop here and take any questions you may have. I will stop sharing my screen as well.
Okay, we have a question submitted. It says, is the invention disclosure restricted to a physical product, e.g. a device or drug or algorithm? Do you have to disclose the system-based solutions that can be further used to develop apps, e.g. a framework for the COVID containment and all the related apps that might derive from it?
I will say that intellectual property related to health IT products is very tricky. It's sometimes difficult to patent apps. And that is why our tech transfer office actually has 2 or 3 people that focus on nothing except IT projects. And so if you're at the University of Michigan, I would strongly suggest that you contact Drew Bennett at the University of Michigan's Tech Transfer Office for more information on securing and protecting your apps. Sometimes a trade secret is the best way to go as opposed to a patent. And the first part of that question about you mentioned disclosures being related to physical entities. Not necessarily, no. You can patent algorithms, things like that as well. But you do have to bring it to the point where you can actually bring it to practice. You have to show enough. You can't just patent an idea. You have to have enough data, enough results to show that you can bring it to. I'm drawing a blank on the term. Bring it to practice, I guess. So sometimes people will go to tech transfer for invention disclosure, and tech transfer will say, well, you need to go back and get a little bit more data to show that you can bring it to practice. But again, talk to your tech transfer office.
Next question asks, do you have experience with licensing surveys, which can be categorized as diagnostic instruments versus infrastructure tool?
I do not, but the University of Michigan certainly does. Because it again sort of falls under the auspices of the IT group within our tech transfer office. And I do know that some of the surveys that have been developed at Michigan have been some of the most frequently requested items from our tech transfer office. They're licensed all the time by the university. So it's when people are doing similar studies and they want to use our standardized scale or scoring system or survey, we license that out and do return a revenue to the university and it's distributed much like any other technology.
Okay, that appears to be it. Well, thank you, Brad, for joining us and lending us your expertise. I want to thank everybody on the call as well. Remember, this is one of 7 as part of this series, so I'll point you to our website to register for one or all of the remaining 6, and the next one will be offered on June 24th.
Yeah, it may be worth mentioning that this one was intentionally a little bit broad, a high-level overview of the process. In some of these subsequent webinars, we're going to be taking a deep dive into some of the intricacies of developing a device or a piece of the software, let's say, and how that preclinical development may work. So look for some of these other upcoming webinars for more details around some of the specific verticals that you're thinking about working in.
And I will encourage you to reach out to any FFMI member when you're on our website or when you get our follow-up communication. If you have a question, please reach out, especially the individual who asked about strategies for business development and bridging connections into labs, a BD representative would be happy to talk to you about that.
Yep. That's the kind of thing our BD group does all the time. So we'd be happy to help.
Okay. Well, thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you next time. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.